welcome. You're watching NewsX with me, Devika Devan. Viewers, I want you to take a moment and think about the sort of world that we're living in, where countries are signing trade deals and pacts, while the other half of the world is at war. This is the current global era, an era that is marked by an increasing sense of them versus us, an increasing sense of insecurity, where each country wants to do what's best for its people, and perhaps rightly so. The past 6 months since the US-Iran war broke out, alliances across the world have been redrawn. Each nation wants its leaders to have an acute sense of who's a trusted ally that has their back and who's not. It's a fractured world, as the academics like to call it. And this fractured world has, as the previous eras, given birth to its own types of leaders. Leadership today isn't about inspiring a generation or about uplifting all humankind or even about ending hostilities. Leadership today is increasingly about three kinds of people. The first are the warmonger businessmen. They start the wars on all sorts of pretexts and contexts, and then they find ways to profit from it. They bully their way into conflicts and turn the world upside down to prove a point. And what's worse, they want you to do as they say, as if the true test of a friendship, of an alliance, is blindly following orders. I needn't to tell you who I'm referring to here. The second type of leaders today are the bystanders, those who just quietly watch from the sidelines while their nations go on and their economies keep running. They make the occasional speech to end hostilities. They do just enough to make the headlines, but not enough to actually stop the war. And then there are those who use their position, their friendships and good leverage, good offices to broker peace where it can actually matter. On that note, let's hear this statement.
The way for India could play a big part is political. You've got Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is a very well-known world statesman, who is very respected, and who India has a long-standing relationship with the Russian Federation, and before that with the Soviet Union, as a non-aligned nation. And President Putin actually pays attention to what Prime Minister Modi tells him. I said so some time ago, and caused a bit of a stir in India when I mentioned the role Prime Minister Modi played in stopping Putin using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine at the end of 2022. But it's true, Prime Minister Modi is one of the few people who actually can exert some pressure and influence on President Putin, and that is clearly something India could do to stop.
That was the Polish Deputy Foreign Minister at the joint India-Poland Economic Commission's meeting in New Delhi. He was heard giving credit to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi for using his good offices to discourage the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war as early as 2022. The Polish Deputy Foreign Minister says Prime Minister Modi is one of the few leaders who can actually exert some pressure on Russia. India has maintained a clear position to resolve all conflicts through diplomacy. In September 2022, India's Prime Minister spoke to Russian President Putin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. And what did he say? He said today is not the era of war. Prime Minister Modi has continued to engage with Putin and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, even meeting the latter in Kyiv in 2024 and on the sidelines of multilateral summits ever since. New Delhi has continued buying discounted Russian crude despite sustained pressure from the US and European allies to curb energy trade with Moscow. India has argued that its purchases are driven by energy security and national interests. Meanwhile, Putin does not feel cornered or blackmailed. Just last month, he described India as a great country and defended New Delhi's independent foreign policy. There are many today, viewers, who argue that India has too much to deal with at home, so why bother getting into the world's problems? And that's partially true. We do have enough issues to solve at home, but we forget that in a world that continues to be so connected, the price of oil that you put in your car in New Delhi actually depends on the actions of America and Iran in the Middle East. So how do we solve for our issues at home if we choose to ignore what's happening in the world, and if we refuse to use our good offices to prevent catastrophes? This is not to say that India's actions are purely selfless, that we are some noble nation. India remains a major buyer of Russian energy and a long-standing defense partner. If Putin had crossed the nuclear threshold, perhaps it would have forced India to abandon its neutral stance. It may have resulted in diplomatic isolation that Russia desperately wanted to avoid. So India surely had its reasons, and more importantly, it chose to act and it chose to speak when it mattered. The point I'm trying to make is simple. With great power comes great responsibility, and this holds true mostly for nations that are big or important, that have enough leverage in the world to make a difference to others. But nations are ultimately run by people and their principles. And the principles of today's leaders are clear before the world to assess. Who will judge history as what? We take that conversation forward. I have with me Ambassador Veena Sikri, former diplomat, with us. Major General Gigi Dwivedi, defense and geopolitical expert, with us. Mr. Himanshu Bhatt, senior journalist, with us. And Shruti Dasgupta, foreign affairs expert, with me as well. Ambassador Sikri, in your assessment, ma'am, how should the world then view some of the steps that India has taken in the past few years, when we've just witnessed war after war after war? We've also been embroiled in a war of our own, which India did take a decision to finish off in a matter of 5 to 6 days.
Yes, I think India enjoys today a very high degree of respect all over the world. Prime Minister Modi is held in the greatest esteem. If you look at the the international polls, the number of people who follow him, he is the most popular leader in the world. There is little doubt about that. And he has a huge respect. We just saw on his most recent tour to Indonesia, Australia and New Zealand how much respect he received. We saw when Prime Minister of Japan was in India about 10 days ago, how much she spoke so warmly about the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. And I think that Prime Minister Modi is respected for his vision, for his ability to state directly what India feels, and for the policy of strategic autonomy and independence in foreign affairs that we have followed. And I think the Deputy Minister of the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland, who is in India for a bilateral with our Ministry of External Affairs, he made a very special reference for a very special purpose. And I think this is important to realize at this point. He said how Prime Minister Modi is so highly regarded by President Putin, and in 2022, it was Prime Minister Modi's intervention and his speaking to President Putin, and we have that famous statement, "This is not the era of war, we must have dialogue and diplomacy." Actually, Prime Minister Modi persuaded President Putin to move away from using tactical nuclear weapons. But that was then. I think today the world is equally on the brink of a similar crisis in Europe, and the intention of the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland is to once again, I think he's appealing for Prime Minister Modi's intervention once again. And I think we must be aware of what is happening. Many in India are not aware because this is not written about in our newspapers. You know that after the attack, there was a recent Ukrainian attack on concert goers outside Moscow. And this created a huge tremor within Russia. That, now Ukraine is attacking the civilian population. After this, the definition of what is happening between Russia and Ukraine has changed. It is no longer called a special military operation. It is now called a state of war. And this has been a huge change in what is happening in Europe. And then there are two very important interviews given by leaders in Moscow. One is by Professor Dmitry Trenin, who is the president of the Russian International Affairs Council, and the other is by the head of the Russian television, Margarita Simonyan. And both of them have spoken about the imminence of war. They have said that Russia is now getting absolutely out of all patience, and they are going to, and not only the imminence of war on Europe, a direct attack on Europe is what Moscow has been talking about. So I think it is very much once again a 2022 moment, and the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland is conveying this message. And the hypocrisy of Europe is even more in evidence when we realize that Europe all these years, while criticizing Russia, while opposing Russia, by fomenting discord, further discord between Ukraine and Russia, they have been buying all the LNG from Russia. In the first 6 months of this year, 2026, Europe has bought 10 million tons of LNG, liquefied natural gas, from Russia. And they are, in fact, as many people say, they are actually financing the war for Russia with Ukraine, because they're giving them billions and billions of euros for the purchase of this LNG. While doing all that, Europe is talking about also talking of a direct war with Russia. They're gearing up, they're increasing their expenditure on defense, which will now go up to about 5% in many countries. Germany particularly has been leading the attack, as it were, the verbal attack at the moment on Europe. And I think that there is so much talk. Everybody in Russia really is talking of being on the brink of war, and brink of World War III, actually. So I think that this is a very dangerous moment, a very, very dangerous moment. And I think maybe this message has been brought once again for our Prime Minister to talk to all the leaders that he knows so well and who respect him so much. But I think we should not at all underestimate. We are all very preoccupied with what's happening in West Asia, with Iran, USA, Israel, that we've sort of taken our eye off the ball as far as the Ukraine-Russia conflict is concerned. And that is now moving towards a very, very dangerous level of seriousness.
All right, let me bring in Major and Gigi Dwivedi into the conversation as well. Major and Dwivedi, what is it that world leaders today can perhaps take away from India? How does one continue this balancing act? And like I said, I don't really need to point out who are some of the leaders who are using the powers that the nations have to create more and more trouble. Who are the ones who are just standing by and watching what's happening, versus who are the ones who are actually trying to do something wherever they can. I'm not saying India has been 100% successful in stopping any war, but yes, we were successful in stopping our own war per se. So keeping all of that in mind, Major Dwivedi, what is it that the world really needs to take away from India as a lesson?
Well, Devika, firstly, pleasure to be on your show, though after a long time. Well, I think the issue you have raised requires a perspective, because it cannot be just answered on what this statement of Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland. Firstly, you said that half the world is at war. I'd like to qualify that I think the major part of the world is at war. Well, in Europe and West Asia is a conventional war, but in Southeast Asia, in fact in India also, we are fighting a proxy war, or the guerrilla warfare. So the point is that today definition of war has changed, and largely I think the globe is in state of war, whether conventional, unconventional, proxy, or the Cold War. The second issue is that if you take Indian history, we have always been on the side of peace. India has never attacked any country, but we have been attacked 4 times, we have only responded. So we are the champions of peace, and we always propagated peace. And today, our Prime Minister is continuing the same policy that we adopted for last almost 8 decades. The third point is, you see, when statements of such nature are made, they have to be seen in a larger perspective. Well, Prime Minister Modi had called that this is not era of peace in Samarkand when in 2022 at the ISO meeting, and that was continuation of our policy. Well, India cannot be on the sidelines. Well, we may not be a great power, but we are a middle power. And therefore, what is happening in the globe is impacting us. And therefore, we need to exercise our clout, we need to exercise our voice, and that's what our Prime Minister is doing. But 2 issues I'd like to clarify as a military strategy or as a military man. That firstly, I'm not very convinced that in 2022, US Russia was on the brink of using tactical nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are used when you have a state of existential crisis, and Russia was not in the state. So therefore, this is need to be corroborated or deliberated. And the second point is leaders have their personal equation, nations have their own institutional memory, and we have a very eminent ambassador here, that nation's institutional memory doesn't change overnight. So therefore, what Prime Minister is doing is continuing our philosophy, our take on the foreign policy. And lastly, Putin, yes, of course, he would listen to people. But let me also tell you, the leaders actually take their own decision. After all, it was 4 years when Prime Minister made that statement, but the war is still on, but the efforts are still on. So therefore, I think every nation, every leader takes his own call. Yes, they listen to the others, but at the end of it, they take their own call. And lastly, please remember that Pakistan is also cozying up to Russia. Russia, China are today in one camp, and lately, number of initiatives have been taken by Pakistan to cozy up with Russia. We have to be watchful. But my final word is that every nation takes its own call. Leaders pursue the policies of the own nation, and Prime Minister Modi is doing a great job in pursuing the policy which India has always abided by, propagated, and practiced. Devika.
Right, absolutely. Himanshu, but bringing into the conversation your thoughts on the Polish Deputy Foreign Minister actually giving some credit there to Prime Minister Modi, even if it's 4 years later, him raising the point that what India has to say does carry some weight today.
Well, the hard truths come out later. There's a saying that way. After 4 years, someone is coming out, and that also a Polish minister is coming out at this present moment when the entire Europe and the doorway to Europe as far as Russia is concerned happens to be Poland. And so the statement from this Polish minister seemed to be very, very interesting geopolitically. That's number one. Number two, when I look at the personal bonhomie of Narendra Bhai and Vladimir Putin, there certainly is a scope that they do talk to each other. You remember an incident, we see now the Deputy Police Minister is talking about 2022 SCO meet. I'll remind you of last year's SCO meet. For 40 minutes, the same two leaders, what were they doing in the limousine of Vladimir Putin in a third country? When the entire spy agencies, of the world were hovering around in that place. What were they doing? But for the intense friendship or a very, very solid fructification of two nations' goals with each other, can this happen? Why is it that, when you have power, you have the responsibility? Some people behave, as you yourself said, some people behave and some people don't behave. We have both the examples today in today's geopolitical world. On one side, Trump has been egging on the Europe to spend 5% of their GDP to the NATO countries for preparing for war, for their defense. Now, when you look take all this context and you look at this, along with the West Asia war, well, things look, yes, that there could have been something. There could have been something more which will come out after another 4 years. What happened in 2025 in that limousine? I'm using that incident time and time again. The reason for that is, it is the same leader who was escorted by Putin to his, golf cart and taken to his bungalow villa also. Which other leader has gone there? And he was treated this way. This optics also says so many things at times. And we in journalism have learned, look for something which is not there. And if I look at it that way, I was very intently listening to Ambassador Sikri. And she was probably right, On one side, the Polish minister may have been saying to Narendra Bhai that now it's time again, you please intervene or say something. Or it could be other way around also. When we look at Bharat's relation with the Eastern European countries today, we see the difference. It could have been a notice, or it could have been a plea, or it could have been a straight way, a subtle message to Russians that Poland may be next after Ukraine in your list, but please spare us. Now that also could be that. This tactical nuclear weapon has become a weapon because we all have been talking about it, but nobody has used it till now.
Yes.
And the moment someone uses it, it will no longer be a weapon. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And that's why I look at this, this particular quote of Polish minister as something, more to do with Europe. More to give a message to Europe that the way Europe thinks, Poland might not be agreeing to all Europe's terms the way Ukraine agreed. I look at it that way.
Okay. All right. Let me bring in Shruti Dasgupta. Shruti, I leave the last word with you. The Polish minister did raise a pertinent point. He said that perhaps some of this diplomacy, tactical diplomacy, can also be used as far as the Iran war is concerned. In your assessment, is that possible? Because Himanshu Bhatt raised a pertinent point. He said that when it comes to India and our diplomatic efforts, we're not one to really boast about them. You've been seeing how Pakistan has been behaving vis-a-vis the peace deal between US and Iran. They're really beating their own trumpet at this point in time. And we've seen what's happened with that peace deal. It requires more than a Mr. Sharif just pretending that there's, that he's trying to salvage the situation and come up with a fair peace deal. So, keeping all of that in mind and the fact that certain countries have already tried, is there a possibility or is there any space for India in that conflict?
I assume they would want India to be involved in it because that they bring a level of stability to the table that Pakistan and Qatar really do not. Both terror-abiding nations, both having major terrorist organizations as their friendly groups, be it Muslim Brotherhood or Hizbul Mujahideen. We know that exactly how those two nations continue to wage war against the world in terms of terror, and them being given the role of interlocutor, mediator, or any of the other names associated with the entire peace charade that is being played out between Iran and USA is exactly just that. It's just a tag. It is not an ultimate process. I don't think India should take this as an invitation to go and put its nose in that conversation, because I am of the very firm belief that before the October of this year, there is going to be a major escalation of that war. Why? Because they're only waiting till the 20th where FIFA gets over and US is done with all its celebratory moods. They've done their 250th, they've done Trump's 80th, they've had their 50 days of fun and games. They are now ready to play the dirty games again. And Netanyahu faces elections in October and Trump faces midterms in November. Both of them need an Iran level victory to be able to sway voters their particular way. So this is going to be a very big escalation that I am predicting as of now, that Iran war is not at an end. So India should not go ahead and take this as an invitation to go and put its nose in that business. It should keep it clean as we have, maintain strategic autonomy, and use these particular statements to, we've put out a Shanti bid for our UN seat, use this statement as a proof of what the world has acknowledged many times over, that India has played a major role in keeping peace in the world, keeping dialogues alive, keeping civilizational continuity alive, and that is what we should focus on. India does have a capacity, but it should not have the intent, at least, to go beyond what it has until now. It is my personal opinion that they should not be taken on beyond that. For the question of what was happening at that particular time, because I've been hearing what the other panelists have been talking, floating about in Western media. So it's a covert way of asking for help, because if the current situation of war continues to escalate, that means Russia is no longer bothered with Ukrainian population. It just wants the land, and now it might turn into a full-on war on that side also. They would also want a resolution of this before the Iran war finds a resolution. They would want a firmer footing on the Ukraine's peace scenario that before the Iran situation turns into a bigger mess for them. And for that, Putin might be ready to play out his last and most favorable cards of pulling out the big guns. Intercontinental ballistic missiles is something that he's already threatened many times over the last 2 years. So they might be looking at an end game. It's a 4-year-long war, already more than that. It's in its 5th year. And so they want an end to it. They want to get the territory back completely and wholly. And I don't think India might have put its point of view forward, and the two leaders with their camaraderie would have ensured that there was weight behind the comments that PM Modi would have offered, or the advice PM Modi would have offered. But Putin is a very shrewd leader himself. He does make his own decisions. If he saw weight in what PM Modi said at that time, it probably means that he was himself also just leaning towards a similar threat rather than an actual nuclear usage in 2022. But that may not be a guarantee for now in 2026.
Okay, all right. On that note, I've run out of time, but I thank all of our guests for joining us on the broadcast to take this conversation forward. We leave it there.